When clients are about to get new cars, the question that comes up to us is, Mike, should I lease the car or should I buy the car? Which then causes me to ask a few questions to arrive at the right financial decisions. So some of the questions I have to ask are, how long do you typically keep cars for? How many miles do you typically drive each year? What is the amount you're looking to put as a down payment for the car? The maintenance considerations and those costs. And I also ask, if this is for a family, do you have any teenagers in the family that will be driving soon? We'll start out by going over the leasing scenario. So the reason why my first question to people is, how long do you typically keep cars for and how many miles do you drive each year, is if you typically keep cars for less than 5 years because you like to trade them in for a new one and you don't drive a ton of miles every single year, that can actually start to favor leasing versus buying. And one of the main reasons is a car is a depreciating asset, means it loses value typically in most cases every single year. So you buy a car for $40,000, 2 years from now you try to trade it in, you might only get $30,000 for that vehicle. So it's lost value over time, and the lion's share of the depreciation usually happens in the first year or two that you own that vehicle. So if you're trading in cars every 3 years and you're taking that mass amount of depreciation every 3 years, you're just stacking loss after loss after loss up. The reason why leasing the car is a slight answer to this depreciation issue is, instead of owning the car, when you lease a car, you're just borrowing it from the dealer. So they have a contract that you sign that says, hey, you are going to be allowed to borrow this car from us for the next 3 years. You're going to pay us, let's say, $600 a month for that 3-year period. And at the end of 3 years, you just bring us the car back. But then this is where the mileage question, where the second question we ask is, how much do you drive every year? Because within your lease agreement, which may typically be 3 years long, they say, hey, over this 3-year period, you're allowed to put 30,000 miles on that car, 10,000 for every single year you own it. And if you go over that mileage allowance, when you come to turn back in the car to us, we're going to hit you with a penalty for every single mile you drive over that threshold, which for many leases is somewhere between 10 cents to 30 cents for every mile that you drive over your lease allowance. Here's an example of how this works. So if you enter into a 3-year lease agreement that has a 30,000 mileage allowance, but you drive more miles than expected, and then you turn in that car with 40,000 miles on it at the end of that 3-year period, and let's say the mileage penalty is 25 cents per mile over that $30,000 limit, you would owe the dealer $2,500 when you go to turn in that car at the end of the lease. For leasees that drive way over the mileage allowance and they get stuck saying, well, I don't have $5,000 to buy out the mileage penalty at the end of this thing, then they may have to look at the option of potentially buying out that car at the end of the lease agreement. Because when you enter a lease agreement, it says, hey, at the end of the 3-year period, if you want to buy this car from us, this is the amount. So if you have, let's say, a $5,000 mileage penalty, you might say, well, I don't mind keeping this car for a little bit longer, so I'll get an actual loan from a bank and buy out that car for the set price. I see this mileage allowance issue as a big risk, mostly for younger professionals, because when you're a younger professional, you can change careers, which then change your travel patterns. So if you're right now working for someone that's a full remote, you work from your home, but now you have this great new career opportunity, but it requires you to drive, let's say, 30 miles one way into the office every single day. So when you got that lease, you weren't planning on switching jobs and driving more, but now you've switched jobs for a better career opportunity, but now you're going to pile on all of these mileage penalties at the end of your lease. So sometimes when you're younger, actually owning the car outright and not having to worry about that mileage variable can sometimes help the long-term cost of owning that vehicle. I will often caution individuals about leaping too quickly to the lease solution, because when you go into a car dealership, usually the first 2 questions they ask you are, how much can you put down and what's your comfortable monthly car payment? And when you look at leasing a car versus buying that same car, buying the same car is inevitably going to be more expensive because you actually own the vehicle. Where leasing it, you're just borrowing it for that 2 or 3 years or whatever the lease arrangement is. So leasing, they might say, hey, there's no down payment on this thing. The lease payment's going to be, only 60% as if you bought the car. So it can entice you from a financial standpoint to say, oh, it's going to be way cheaper to lease. But then you got to be worried about the trapdoors with the mileage. And is that the best solution for you over the long term? The other small benefit of leasing is you might have lower maintenance costs associated with that vehicle because, again, you're borrowing it. Usually you have to keep up with the routine maintenance and pay for that, like oil changes and whatnot. But usually the big stuff that happens is a new car, and it might have those robust warranties. So you might not be out of pocket versus if you own that car and something big goes wrong out of warranty, then you have to pay for it because you essentially own the vehicle. Quick recap on leasing: tends to favor individuals, don't drive a lot of miles, usually trade in their cars in under 5 years. So if they say, hey, Mike, I like to trade in for the new car every 3 years, that's more in the leasing, and life is predictable, meaning I'm not going to go from, traveling my 8,000 miles a year to 20,000 miles a year because there was a life surprise. Now we'll shift gears over to what situations favor buying the car, which is many of the polar opposites of what we just discussed with leasing. So as soon as I have a client that tells me, Mike, I like to keep my cars for 6 years, 7 years, 8 years, I do drive more than 15,000 miles a year on a regular basis, and sometimes even more than that. When we get into buying a car, while it's a depreciating asset, maybe that car loan is for 5 years, but after that car loan is paid off after 5 years, you might be driving it for another 3 years for free, for no car payments, where if you're in a lease agreement, you are always going to have a car payment. So people that hold on to their cars for a longer period of time could really favor buying the vehicle versus leasing it. The other category that favors buying is just individuals that drive a lot. You're going to be putting on more than 12,000 miles a year, so you're going to probably go over that lease allowance, or the driving patterns are erratic. And sometimes I see people greatly underestimate the mileage that they put on their car. They say, well, I only drive here to work, so they do some quick math, but you forget about driving the kids back and forth to practice, like the weekend trips you take, all the travel you do in the summertime. Like, you really have to have a good handle on your mileage, because that can be the kryptonite to going into a lease agreement versus having the freedom, if you own the car, that you can drive as many miles as you want. Buying the car from a financial standpoint takes a little bit more planning, because usually it requires some form of down payment that you will have to save for, and the monthly car payments may be higher because essentially, again, you are owning the vehicle, but it still could make long-term financial sense, especially if you get to the no car payment land after your car loan is paid off. Owning the car, we also recommend having some form of maintenance budget, or part of your emergency fund is earmarked for stuff for the car, because cars are going to need new tires. If you're driving cars that have 90, 100,000 miles on them, at some point it's going to need some repairs, and you have to have the ability to pay for those repairs when they arise. So just having a good budget for that maintenance over the life of the car. When individuals go to buy a car and they need a car loan, I always caution them over taking auto loans for more than 5 years, because many of those individuals end up in what's called a negative equity event. So it used to be when you took a car loan, your option was 5 years. They would amortize your car payments over that 5 years and say, here it is. Now I find when I go into dealerships, they usually start at a 7-year amortization. Why? Because it makes the monthly payment lower, because they're stretching the value of that car over 7 years instead of 5. But the problem is, as I mentioned at the beginning, a car is a depreciating asset. And if the value of the car is going down, but the value of your auto loan is going down by a lesser amount, and all of a sudden you got to trade it in, and there's a mismatch, you could be upside down, meaning your auto loan could be $15,000, but the car's only worth $10,000, so you have a $5,000 problem that either you have to come out of pocket for that $5,000 when you turn in the car, or the bank that's giving you your next loan has to allow you to roll in that negative equity into your next auto loan. So if you buy another car for $40,000, but you have $5,000 worth of negative equity in your old car, they would make an auto loan for $45,000. So you're already behind the 8 ball. And then this negative equity trap starts again. And at some point, the negative equity might get so big that they say, we're not allowing you to roll this in the next loan. It's too huge. We're not going to allow you to roll $15,000 worth of negative equity, and it puts you in a really bad spot. So I usually encourage individuals, if you can stick to the 5-year car loan, that usually makes the most financial sense. The last scenario I'll mention is the teenage driver. So sometimes we'll have family, mom or dad are looking to get a new car, and I know they have kids, and I'll say, what are the age of the kids? Maybe they have a 13-year-old, 12-year-old, and they're like, hey, we're going to have a driver in the family in the next 3 or 4 years, and we'll start talking about what's the plan for the car? Are they going to have to buy their own car? Do you plan to get them a car? And if you plan to get them a car, then does it make more sense for you to say, hey, I'm going to could get a car now. Instead of leasing it, I'm going to buy it. Then by the time my new driver's ready, that car has been paid off, I own it outright, and then I can just hand it over to the teenager, and at that point, I will go get a new car, so sometimes that plan can work out. A fun topic, sometimes clients will ask me, well, Mike, what do? You're our investment advisor. Do you lease cars? Do you buy cars? And I tend to find myself more in the buy category, mainly because as an investment advisor, I don't like depreciating assets. I like assets that increase in value, so I tend to commit as little as I can within reason to the vehicles that are naturally going to lose value, but also I tend to drive more miles. I do keep cars for 7, 8 years or potentially longer as long as it's still doing okay. And I live in upstate New York, which sometimes I have to drive through 2 feet of snow. So I have a Jeep Wrangler, which can get through, and I'm just happy if that thing just gets me from A to B. But absolutely to each their own. If I kept cars for 3 years, I didn't drive a ton of miles, I might have to revisit that, but it's just like buying cars right now seems to fit my habits. I hope this was helpful. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to me at greenbushfinancial.com. Thank you.